When I started this podcast, this idea, I didn't really think anyone would want to listen to these conversations. I honestly just did it for me. I wanted to learn. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to figure out what was going on in the industry. But I launched the first episode with Roy West 2 weeks ago, and the response has been overwhelming. Hundreds of people have already listened, and I've received great feedback from the content strategy and UX writing community. So if you were one of those people who listened to that episode, thank you so much for downloading and listening. The response has really been overwhelming. And if this is the first time listening, welcome. And please go back and listen to the first episode as well. I think you'll really get something out of it. I'm really excited to introduce today's episode. Today I spoke with Sophie Tahran from Invision. Now, Invision is a really interesting company. It's grown like a rocket over the past few years, but there's also something operationally about it that's very curious. It's a fully remote company. So while there is an office, most people work wherever they live. And I think for a lot of UX writers and content strategists, this is kind of an ideal situation. Most companies now need these types of roles, but geographically, you're limited to the companies within your city. If more companies were like Invision and fully remote, then there might be more opportunities for this industry. So it was really great to speak to Sophie about this and also about her time at Lyft before joining Invision. She has some really great thoughts about not only UX writing and content strategy, but also how to set guidelines and governance across a company for these types of things. So I think you're really going to get a lot out of it. Before I just go into the interview, a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I just want to reiterate again, I am not an audio engineer, so I'm learning a lot of this as I go. So the audio quality is not necessarily going to be top-notch like you hear in some professionally produced podcasts. So please be patient as I'm trying to perfect my skills and make sure that the hisses and crackles and pops aren't too bad. Thankfully, the feedback has been pretty good, but I just want to say that up front, so please be patient. Secondly, please, if you like this podcast, leave a review. The more people leave reviews, the more people can find it in Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and Spotify. So particularly on Apple, if you have any feedback, please leave a review. Even if you have constructive criticism, I would really love to hear it, and everything helps. So please feel free to leave a review. With that, I think I'm good. Here's my interview with Sophie Tahran from Invision. Invision is a fully remote company. So for some people, moving to New York would be a massive burden and it would be a huge life change. For you, I imagine it's still that, but the ability to work from anywhere really means that the stress of it all is taken away. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I have been working at Invision for about a year now, and over the summer I ran almost a test run where I traveled through Europe for a little over a month to see if I actually could work and just be as productive and as efficient while on the road. And that worked out really well. So I've always been curious about New York, and as a California native have always wanted to give it a shot. So with this job, I was able to move out here. I'm just living in a sublet, no huge commitment, but I'll be out here at least through the end of the year, so for the next few months, and just giving it a shot without having to change jobs or have this massive upheaval in my life. And I have a lot of flexibility that comes with it, which is really nice. I can go back to California, travel a little bit more if I'd like to. Really, the big constraint is good Wi-Fi and time zones. As long as I have those working in my favor, then I'm good to go.
Yeah, that's it. And I think there's obviously I don't live in San Francisco, and I think living there and having gone there tends to be sometimes a type of a bubble mentality. Like you get very wrapped up in what's going on in the industry, and that could be a good thing, obviously. But moving away, I think you get a different perspective when you're working outside of that environment than you do when you're working in. And so moving to a different city and doing the same type of work can open you up to new forms of inspiration and all sorts of connections that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And that's something that I felt just when I started working at Invision, because my team is all over the world. So especially as a writer, I found myself going through design reviews or content reviews, realizing that I was having to switch some of the words that I was using because they didn't work universally. They weren't as internationally friendly as I had thought. So one thing that came up was an error message that said, that doesn't quite look right, I think is what the original version said. And my manager, who's in London, pointed out that he uses the word right or quite right a little bit differently than I would. So just a quick copy switch using correct instead of right was one of many lessons that I've learned from working with people all over the world. And I'm now taking that one step further by actually placing myself all around the world and experiencing living in new places as well.
Yeah, that's great. And in fact, I think we'll talk about that a little bit later because I want to hear more about the tools you use to stay in touch and all of that. But first I want to start with, you have a pretty extensive history in content and specifically UX writing. And I think it's interesting because you're seeing a lot of people move into UX writing who have all sorts of different backgrounds, some in editorial, some in UX, some in technical writing. But you have a pretty strong background in writing and editorial, which I think is increasingly rare in this industry. So to start really broadly, how did you get interested in product writing and UX writing? And before that, editorial, where did that come from?
Yeah, so my interest in writing stemmed from, it's really been a lifelong interest. I was a big reader growing up, and I think that encourages a lot of people to get into writing, but I didn't realize that you could get into writing without necessarily writing something like a novel. I didn't realize that there were so many different opportunities in workplaces and companies to tell a brand story, describe their product, improve a user experience, until I got out of college and had the opportunity to work at Lyft. And I joined when Lyft had about 100 employees, where everyone was wearing a bunch of different hats, just basically doing anything that they possibly could to push the company forward. And I'd always loved writing. I studied copy editing in college. But it was at that point that I had the opportunity to join the creative team and become a copywriter. Learned a lot and worked on a ton of different aspects of the business, from our knowledge base, so support guidelines, help center, response macros, up through driver-facing communication, and finally writing product launch communication. So once I started working on product launches, I realized that I liked moving even further up into a product lifecycle, so that I was not only announcing a product that was fully formed, but starting to work closely with our product design team to identify how we could use content to improve the user experience. So it was there that I really had that opportunity to move more into a UX writing type role. And then took that one step further at Invision, where I became our first UX writer and was able to really build out the craft there. In which case it's not only writing, it's a lot of forming relationships, building out processes, and figuring out what works best for everyone so that it is a nice collaborative effort. And content is part of the entire product creation process.
Yeah, absolutely. What facilitated that move from doing knowledge-based content to wanting to move to the creative team? Did you look at what they were doing and think, oh yeah, that looks really great? Or had you always wanted to write for products and user interfaces? What was the driving force behind that decision?
Yeah, I would say at the time, because we were or especially at Lyft, were and still are very scrappy, it was just a matter of wanting to really understand all of the different types of writing that could be done. And I talk about this all the time. I'm so thankful that I had a chance to work on knowledge-based content with the support team, because I felt that it gave me a very nuanced understanding of the product, and you are out on the front lines where you're understanding what users want and how they react to something, so that you're not writing from that glass castle. So once I really understood the nuance of the product, then I wanted to be able to kind of weave that throughout the entire company. So I really set my sights on working with the creative team. I loved the work that they were doing and the writers that were already on the team. And I wanted to really mesh my experience on knowledge base with something that's a little bit more consumer facing and a little bit splashier in copywriting.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I've spoken to a couple of writers already on the podcast who started off they didn't start off, but they spent a great deal of time in technical writing and working in the instructional areas of their business, and then moved into content writing, UX writing. And I think it's a really great example of how UX writers need to be product experts, and they really need to know their products extremely well. I've spoken to UX writers and content writers who, they know a little bit about the product and they sort of know broad strokes, but when it comes to the real nitty-gritty detail, they don't have it, and they often rely on the technical writers for that type of knowledge. Whereas I would say that actually every writer, no matter their position, probably needs to be an expert in the product they're writing about. So it's interesting to see that you've moved from that side to the next. It obviously means that you still, I would assume, you still carry that importance of really knowing the product you're talking about.
Definitely. I completely agree. I'm a huge context person, and I think that's one of the reasons why I believe it's so important for writers to be in the room and involved as early as possible. When you really understand the designer's point of view and all of the strategy that went into every decision, then you're not only making sure that writing is part of that strategy and part of those decisions, but you're also educating yourself so that all of the thought process that went into it. You are completely in the weeds so that you can work at simplifying that and just delivering what the user really needs to know at that point in time.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously it's easier in some businesses than others, right? Like obviously there are some that are going to have a pretty straightforward app. Now, I would assume that Lyft, even though it's, that I'm sure there are complex elements to it and there are different features and so on, it's really one straight product, and maybe you'll correct me on that. Whereas if you're working for, let's say, a software company that's producing ERP software, there's obviously going to be huge different streams of knowledge that you need to get your head around. And obviously, so the difficulty of that is going to move from company to company. Not that I'm saying Lyft would be simple by any means, but it's just obviously it differs from business to business.
Definitely. And I mean, another layer of complexity to add to it is the number of audiences that you have. So with Lyft, what we ran into time and time again is that we have a number of different audiences. There's driver facing, there's passengers, and then in the recent years, after I departed, they've branched into autonomous, they've branched into scooters. There are all of these different types of use cases that you're writing for. So it's not only a matter of understanding the product itself, but also understanding your audience. So it really goes both ways, as I'm sure you've experienced as well. There's a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah, cool. And so tell me about the workflow at Lyft. Was it you sitting on the side and coming up with copy for designs that had already been made? Were you an integral part of the UX team and taking part in sketching and wireframes? How did the process work there?
Yeah. So when I was on the creative team, I really kind of moved through a few different areas. So I worked on everything from like radio ads to Facebook ads to product launches to words that we were putting on like ping pong balls and phone cases up through writing for products. I think one good example of working closely with the product team was for the launch of the Lyft driver app. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this, but when Lyft first launched and really for its first few years, there was just one app for both passengers and drivers. And that worked to begin with, but as Lyft grew, there were just so many features and so many different pieces that we were trying to shove into one single app that it was time to split it into a dedicated passenger app and a dedicated driver app so that we could better serve both sides, speaking of all of those different audiences that you're working for. And so in that case, I worked closely not only with the product marketing team to come up with a name for the Lyft driver app. Were we going to get really creative and call it something like Zoom or whatever it is? Or do we need to be pretty straightforward with it, which was the direction that we ended up going in after some user research, and just call it the Lyft driver app? A lot of considerations came into play there. some drivers don't speak English as their first language. We were considering whether we would need to translate this someday, and ultimately just what would resonate with our audience best and most easily when you're just trying to get on the road. And so that was an example where, obviously it's a huge product. It's a huge undertaking. So we would sync constantly. You'd be in the room with the PM, the PMM. So, people that are in charge from both sides, the engineers working on the product, the product designers, really every step of the way, you're just trying to make sure that everyone's on the same page and all of those different moving pieces are aligned. And really what would happen when I was working with product design was I would step into design reviews so that the product designer would have those initial wireframes and walk us through all of the different touch points. And we would talk through where we needed to include copy and why, whenever there was a chance to communicate through motion or visuals, then we would lean on that. Sometimes we would need more space for copy because it was a little bit more complicated of a concept. So it was a nice, really collaborative effort, and I think everyone felt pretty good about the end result.
That's awesome. That's great. And it's not often that you see that type of collaboration, particularly in a business like that where it's incredibly fast moving. So it's really, I'm actually a little jealous to hear you talk about it because my experience has been, even though you might have collaboration between engineers, UXs, and producers and so on, it's rare that you always get everyone in the room talking about it as you go. There might be, you might have some in the first stage and then some in the second stage. So there is that collaboration, but it really seems like it was tightly woven into the actual process, which is it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think I really attribute that to a few different things. When you are moving that fast, really making sure that you're being as efficient with your time as possible is huge. And planning ahead, making sure that you're asking all of the questions up front so that it's just a matter of actually executing on it and moving quickly from there. And also just having great people leading the way. We had incredible PMs on the project who were always thinking 100 steps ahead to try and clear any obstacles out of the way before we got there. And I've really experienced the same thing on Invision as well. Incredible minds that are somehow able to think way ahead of the game, so that when it comes to the creative work of design or writing, we're able to think big and design without boundaries, and then come together to kind of work back into what's actually feasible for that stage in the product design process.
Yeah. Looking back at Lyft, what do you think? Now you've been out of there for a couple of years, I think.
About a year.
About a year. Looking back, what do you think were the biggest lessons you learned during that time? Not just about UX writing, but also just about the process of interacting with a team. Is there anything you really take away from that time?
Yeah. I would say I absolutely loved working there, and I feel like that's generally a pretty common feeling, which I think is always great to see. A couple things that, really stuck with me. First off, how much of a mission-driven company it is. You talk to the co-founders, you talk to the people that had been there since day one, and they really believe in this bigger mission of changing how people get around, and bringing people together through technology instead of just looking down at your phone, pressing a button, and stepping into the back seat. So there were those big ideas that were driving people forward, so that alignment came, not only from meetings and documents and OKRs and goals. It really came from a common goal that everyone was working toward, which I think is not easy to create, but you can really see the impact of that. And I'd say the other thing in terms of actual day-to-day work and the workflow that we were going through was how dedicated everyone was to, not just checking the boxes, but taking a task, pushing it as far forward as they possibly can. Not saying, we'll tackle that tomorrow, or let's, bench that until the next meeting or whatever it is. We were really pushing forward, 100% every day, so that, we could all get to that one common goal together. So a lot of great teamwork, a lot of really inspiring people that we were working with, and, working on cool products that are consumer facing definitely doesn't hurt either.
Absolutely. What did you come out of there thinking about UX writing? Because this was really your first time you mentioned moving into that type of work from other type of editorial. Coming out of there, what did you have any thoughts about not just the work you had done, but also the industry? Because I think it's in the past couple of years that UX writing has really emerged as not as a discipline, but it's becoming more defined. People are really forming universal product descriptions around what they want in a UX writer. So coming out of Lyft, did you have any thoughts about who you were as a UX writer and where you fit in the industry and where you might want to go next?
Definitely. So a couple of things there. First was the power of a company voice. And what was especially interesting about UX writing at Lyft was Lyft has such this strong brand voice that stemmed from really the first writer that was there, and really the first team. Jen Chen is someone that I really look up to. She really paved the way in the brand voice there. It's very unique. It's very conversational, human, real. And when it comes to UX writing, one of the biggest things that I had to learn was UX writing is so different from something like copywriting because you're not looking for the splashy moment. You're not looking for the pun. You're looking for clarity above everything else. So taking that brand voice that is so unique and so, so uniquely Lyft was a real challenge in communicating that same feeling, that same kind of tone, that same voice, that same personality in a way that wasn't distracting from the user experience. So that was huge for me. And in terms of my place in the UX writing community, especially during my time at Lyft when I was first starting out, I was amazed at how open people were to meeting up with me. So John Sato, a UX writer at Dropbox, was very open to meeting up with me. We grabbed coffee when I was first starting to do this UX writing thing, and I had no idea what I was doing. I was grasping at Medium articles, Googling things, just looking for any sort of help and information about this field, because there isn't really a ton of content out there in terms of textbooks and classes. A lot of it is very grassroots. So I literally just reached out to anyone who had UX writer in their title in Silicon Valley. And I was able to meet up with writers from Pinterest and Dropbox and Facebook and all of these companies that I had looked up to. And they were incredibly helpful and so generous in meeting up with me and building this community of writers that was kind of creating and advocating for this field on their own.
Hi everybody, I'm sorry to interrupt the interview, but I wanted to tell you about something I've been working on recently. Last year, some senior UX writers from Google, Amazon, and I got together and we noticed a problem. Companies need UX writers. People want to be UX writers, but there aren't a lot of opportunities for training in UX writing, so we fixed that problem. We created the first online self-paced course in UX writing, and it's going off. We already have 66 students who are learning the fundamentals of UX writing. And when we talk about the fundamentals, we don't just mean a little bit of microcopy. We offer training in, yes, voice and tone, but also content deliverables, how to work as part of the design team, and the type of things you'll be expected to do as a UX writer day in and day out. We think it's going really well, and that's why we're getting endorsements from people like Jen Schaefer, who's the content manager at Netflix. And we already have rave reviews from students. So go to uxwriterscollective.com and check it out. Listeners to this podcast can get a 20% discount by using the code PODCAST20. We think it's great for anyone who wants to get certified, whether that's a beginner UX writer or if you're a team and you want to get certified together. So check it out, uxwriterscollective.com. And now back to the interview.
I talk to younger people a lot about getting into tech and development and UX writing and whatever. And I think one of the things that they often don't think about is you can go up to people and just ask to spend 20 minutes with them. It's worth it to just jump on LinkedIn, even if you have to pay for the premium for a year. Just messaging as many people as possible, just saying, "Can I buy you a coffee and can we chat for 25 minutes?" Most people will either say yes, or if they can't do it, they'll at least be willing to go and meet with you. And obviously, you need to be smart about it. Like, you need to go with a list of questions, and you can't just be like, vaguely tell me about your life. You have to get something out of it. But I think one of the best things you can do in moving into a discipline including UX writing, is really just contacting the people who are doing it and getting as much advice as possible, because it'll steer you right from making wrong decisions. It'll give you the best practice on what to do next. It's really the best way to go. I think you were smart to do that, because not a lot of people do it. I guess they assume that, oh well, they're off doing their jobs, so they're busy, and so I won't disturb them. But really, you've got nothing to lose.
Yeah, it is a scary thing to reach out to someone cold. And that really was a beneficial part of being in San Francisco, where if I reached out to someone and they were open to meeting up, I was 2 blocks away from them usually, because all of these companies are all really packed together in one place. But I completely agree. It's just about doing it in a respectful, smart, kind way, appreciating that people have a limited amount of time. So if you spell out exactly what you're looking for, why you chose to reach out to them specifically, be on time, follow up. What I found is those people that I reached out to who were so helpful to me in those beginning stages, I have been able to become good friends with. We see each other at meetups all the time, at conferences. It really does come full circle, especially in the UX writing community, where it's still comparatively small. It's still relatively tight knit. So those people that you'll see and that I'm guessing will be happy to help you out in the beginning will be around for the years to come.
It's interesting that you mentioned that it's small, because it is small. I think there's only 100 job ads on LinkedIn right now for UX writers in the United States. There's very few in Australia. Where I'm based, and I know there are several in Europe and in the Middle East and so on, but it is a niche thing. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether you think it's going to grow, because as Silicon Valley does, the rest of the world follows, and obviously UX writers are becoming more popular there. Is this going to become a more popular job title, do you think, or is it going to stay niche?
I think I've seen a lot of growth in the past year. So really what I've seen is a lot of companies, especially, if you aren't the Googles and Facebooks and Apples of the world, they just don't have the resources to dedicate to someone that specialized at this point. But what I have seen is that many more companies are starting to open up contract roles for UX writers. They're really testing the waters. And I think that's a good sign. They're, starting to open up this role to see if they do want to take the leap and commit full time. So I've seen a lot of openings open up, or, people reaching out to me asking if I can recommend other UX writers, or, if I'd be willing to help out as they start shaping these job descriptions and shaping these roles. So I think there is definitely a lot of movement toward a bigger commitment to UX writing. In terms of the longevity of the role, what I see as being pretty permanent is dedication to providing a good user experience regardless. And I think words are a big part of that. And, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. I could see the actual title shifting. I could see the placement of the role shifting. Different companies call UX writers content strategists or, content designers. There are a ton of different terms out there that mean, slightly different things in some cases, or the same thing in other cases. But I feel like having someone focused on the words that you're actually interacting with and how you describe a product to a user is something that I think will be around for a while.
Yeah, in the end, it really doesn't matter what the job title is. The job title is really incidental. It's more, the skills. What are you doing and how are you contributing to the user experience? So I want to talk about Invision, because I think this is an interesting company. Obviously, it's skyrocketed pretty quickly over the past few years. I don't know a UXer who doesn't use the product, and it's become really a standard. So it's an interesting company to talk about. What drew you to wanting to work there?
Yeah. So when I was at Lyft, I absolutely loved the team. It was very bittersweet. It was a really rough decision to make to leave. But after being there for almost 4 years, I was interested in the opportunity to build out a UX writing practice from scratch. At a slightly smaller company. So Invision, when I joined, was at about 600 employees, which was really one of my favorite times at Lyft, where the company has matured, it's found its footing, but you still have enough flexibility to have ownership over what you're doing. You know people across the company, but you're in this stage of growth that's really exciting. You know, you're bringing in a lot of senior leadership. So I really liked the place that Envision was in. I loved how specialized it was within the product design industry. I felt that, especially for UX writing, it was pretty priceless to have such an insider look at the design process and the people that were creating it. And also, given that Invision is such a strong, community advocate, they're very active at events in creating resources and guidelines and books about the design process. I really loved how active the company has been in the design community. So, all great things. The role was something that I was especially interested in, being the first UX writer, and of course, the people that I would be working alongside are some of really my inspirations were the people that I knew and had been inspiring me for months and years. So being able to work alongside them was something that I just couldn't pass up.
It's interesting that you mentioned you were the first UX writer there, because I think there's a lot of discussion online about, and particularly in Slack communities, the content and UX writing Slack communities, about how to create style guides and really how to create process and governance around UX writing and tone of voice. I imagine that would have been one of the first things you tackled when you joined there.
Exactly. Yep. I came on board, and I also was very, very lucky because Invision has such an incredible content marketing team already. So I wasn't the first writer. I was just the first writer on product design. So I was really standing on the shoulders of giants because Invision has this incredible blog with so much great content and such great writers at the company already. So it was a matter of reaching out to the writers on the marketing side to see what resources we already had. We did have a concise style guide already, but we worked to really build that out to be something that the entire company could use, whether you're a writer on marketing or product design, you are a support agent, you are a lawyer, really anyone across the company who's writing something, even an email, could refer to this to make sure that we're all sounding like Invision. So that was one of the first projects that I tackled. I also expanded it out into voice and tone guidelines. Coming up, we'll be expanding on content-specific guidelines. So how many characters do we have space for in an error message? What does a pop-up look like versus a banner? So just so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time. So doing a lot of that foundational work is huge. I also sit on our basically design system team within product design. So the entire team that I'm on is focused on standardizing those practices, building out these processes, laying that foundation so that when we're working, we can work as efficiently and consistently as possible.
And I think this is one thing that people don't realize a lot of the time in a UX writing role. It's as much about the governance as it is about the writing. You need to really set out guidelines for the rest of the company or the organization about how to write, when to write it, the process of doing so. And I think I would really love to ask you about the specifics of doing this, because I've seen this question come up again. How do I create a style guide? How do I create tone of voice? Especially because people find themselves not in tech organizations, where I think tone of voice is probably something that's quite well known. And if people talk about the tone of voice, they understand what that means. But if you're at a small, IT services company in Indiana with maybe, like 1,000 employees, and you come on and you've been asked, we need to update our communications, or we need to create a tone of voice style guide, people have they're a bit confused about how to start. So how did you go about creating that tone of voice? Obviously, you had a bit of a head start. You said there were writers already in the organization. But what were the first sort of steps you made towards creating that document or governance and distributing it to the wider team?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing, at least for me, when it comes to voice and tone, is that a company's voice, it's not made up. It's not like you're going into it saying, I would like to sound like X, Y, and Z. It comes from a place of truth. And that's what I experienced at Lyft. That's what I've experienced at Invision. And, on side projects that I've worked on over the years. is a company has a voice. It's just a matter of articulating that and identifying what exactly it sounds like. So specifically at Invision, what I started out doing, because I was coming into a company that was already a few years old and had hundreds of employees, was I conducted interviews. I talked to people across the company in a number of different organizations that had been there for multiple years, who were just starting out. And I asked them a bunch of different questions, like, if Invision were a person, who would they be? What would they do? What would their hobbies be? We also talked about things like, how do you think our audience and our users perceive us? And is that consistent with how we perceive ourselves? To make sure that we aren't just talking to ourselves. We're speaking to our audience and our users in a way that resonates with them and that feels real to them and feels authentic. So I asked a lot of those questions and then distilled that into really a set of recommendations and shopped that around to people across the company to make sure that it really felt like us. Really, what I was hoping to avoid altogether was the feeling that I was putting my fist down and saying, okay, we sound like this now. It was mostly a matter of identifying what we had been doing and whether that was exactly how we wanted to sound and relate to our audience. And that was the expectation that we wanted to set moving forward.
Yeah, it's an interesting process because I think for a lot of people, the tone of voice, as you mentioned at the start, it's something that comes from... They think, oh, I want the company to sound like XYZ. Whereas really, what, as you said, the real question is, well, what are the values of the company? What are we trying to achieve? What's our strategic vision? Those are the more important questions to be answering. Because I think a lot of the time, sometimes writers want to make something funky or sassy or quirky to show that they're a great writer and they can do all this type of cool stuff and they're flexible. But really, clarity is the most important factor here, and if something is clear and concise and able to get the message across, that's much more valuable than being able to write a sassy headline just because you think you can.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like, especially when it comes to voice and tone, a lot of companies, especially when they're starting out, you lean on what works. So, as a writer, you'll hear a lot of, oh, I want to sound like this specific company. I want to sound like, Slack or Lyft or Dropbox or, Apple or Facebook or whoever it is. And I understand, if you're just starting out, you don't have the resources to really go through an entire exercise, but I, can't underscore enough how important it is to really carve out your own path and figure out what you should sound like and how you are talking to and with your users and your audience in general to make sure that it sounds authentic in the end. Really, I'd say the voice that you use and the words that you use really determine what your relationship is with your users. Are you an advisor? Are you authoritative? Are you a friend? Identifying that and communicating that through how you speak to one another is really one of the most powerful aspects of writing, I think.
It is. I agree. And I think there's an interesting contradiction to this in that if you look at a lot of software companies, and I think actually Invision is one exception to this, which I think is really great. If you look at a lot of software companies, there's a bias towards everything needs to be short and snappy and concise, which is good as a principle, but it's also the same as if you were doing what I described earlier, doing this sort of wacky writing without any sort of direction to it. If you go the opposite direction the entire way, what you can do is make it so concise and so short and so bland that you really strip out the tone of voice, and so it doesn't sound like anything at all. So it's a hard balance to get right, and I think Invision's good because there are these little moments of color, both in the product and on the website, where you're reading and you think, oh, okay, I can see the tone of voice coming through, even though it is adhering to those concise, short principles, which I don't think every company gets right. Maybe you have a different view, but that's certainly how I see it.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, I think one of the important considerations there is there's a time and a place for everything. If you're going through a billing flow or you're having trouble logging in and you're just trying to present your work to a client, or, it's a high stress situation like that, then that's definitely not where you want to add in those bits of personality, and, show a little color. Those are the places where you really just want the user to get to that next step, because that's all they're focused on anyway. If it is something where, it's a fun success screen or it's an interaction that they won't see very often, that's a place where you can add that fun touch where, it's unexpected, but it adds a little bit of flavor and shows that, there is a human behind the screen after all, just in a place where the user will welcome it.
Exactly. At MYOB, we talk about tone of voice like a mixing board. You have your 3 or 4 tone of voice characteristics, and on any one page or screen of the product, you dial up certain aspects of the tone of voice, and then you dial others down, like you would when mixing music. Sometimes it's appropriate to be funny and silly, and other times, no, that's just going to make your user hate you. So I completely agree. One thing I want to talk about, you've got an extra challenge in doing this, though, because, as we mentioned before, Invision is a completely remote company. Everyone works either from home or from their own working spaces. And to a lot of people, that sounds extremely scary. I know for myself, I think I get a little bit nervous just thinking about it and thinking, oh, how could I even go about working in that type of environment? I'd really love to hear you talk about how you've managed to do that in that type of working situation, and particularly the tools you're using to make that process easier than it might otherwise be.
Definitely. Yeah, I would say, people have different reactions to working remotely. For some, they say that sounds incredible. You have all this flexibility. You can work from anywhere. You can travel the world. For others, it is a scary thing because a lot of your routine is rooted in, going to an office every day. You have your commute, you have that schedule. I think really the key to it is building that same sort of routine and comfort into how you work from home. And a lot of that comes from, not just leaping out of bed in your pajamas and, hopping onto a screen 2 seconds before a call. For some people, that's, taking a walk before you go online, scheduling in breaks. A lot of people, will come into a WeWork space or a co-working space. And we do make sure to have regular meetups in person as well. So that helps, really build that camaraderie. But in terms of how we work and make it as efficient as possible, first off, whenever we have meetings, we use Zoom and we always keep our videos on. So that way you're still able to read your body language. You still have semblance of actually being in a meeting, being in a room with people. It's just that, you're in a meeting with people in, North Carolina, Cleveland, London, and Berlin at the same time. So a lot of those tools really help. I also feel that we're pretty good at documentation as well. So instead of having those hallway conversations where you catch one person up on a project and then may forget to fill in the rest, we rely pretty heavily on our various documents. So we're kind of a mix of paper and Google Docs right now. We also are huge on Slack. I was very surprised to see that we really aren't an email heavy company. I actually barely ever use my inbox. We're just all about Slack, all in on Slack. So big on a lot of different channels. We constantly are updating all of our team channels so that everyone has the latest news. Obviously have all company meetings very regularly. So it's just a matter of keeping everyone in a line and everyone aligned. And what I found is, really when I was first starting out, a lot of the discomfort that I felt was kind of shaking off the assumption that productivity was tied to physically being in an office. Sitting at a desk was seen as being productive, versus when you're working remotely, your productivity is linked to what you're actually delivering. So, I had those first few days where you're thinking, okay, if I am working from, the co-working space versus home versus, my desk versus my kitchen table, does that mean that I'm a better or worse employee? Does that mean that I'm contributing more or less? And the answer is really just, find what works best for you. And really what matters is what you're actually, bringing to the table. There's also a lot of trust built into it. If you are online and you're getting your work done and, you're doing what you need to do, then the rest doesn't really matter. Which is completely different from going into an office every day where, if you're sitting at your desk from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. or whatever your hours are, then, you could be seen as being, just as productive as anyone else, when that isn't necessarily the result when it comes to your output.
Really, a big part of your job is not just showing what you've written, but your process and your ideas of getting there and your rationale, which is really, I would say, more important. I've interviewed copywriters before, and we've asked them to do a copy task, and to me, I'm not really looking at what they've written so much, although that's definitely part of it. I'm really looking at why did you decide to make these choices, and what's your thought process there. I imagine working next to someone, I literally sit next to our UX designers, so I can sort of show them, this was my thought process, this is what I was doing, and so on. Remotely, obviously, you can do that as well, but it obviously depends on the tools you're using and so on to do that in a structured way, so you can show them both visually and with audio. And I imagine you bake that into your work experience, so it feels natural for you working remotely. But I think for other people who perhaps they work remotely with freelance clients or so on, or they work from home and so on, they may not consider that part of it when displaying their work. And as you've described, it's an essential part of that UX process.
It really is. I agree. And I think Invision has done a really good job of setting up a typical day in the life so that we're constantly talking to each other, constantly on the same page. So we have a lot of hours that overlap in a typical workday. So even though a lot of my team is, in the UK or Europe or on the East Coast of the US, we start, or at least it's my morning, we start the morning in design jams. So we spend, normally an hour in the morning showing our work, going over what everyone's been working on, so that we're not only all on the same page, but we have a chance to weigh in with any feedback or changes before the project moves too far forward. So we're really looking at those lo-fi designs, and I'm in all of the design jams even as a writer. So I'm in there alongside all of the product designers, and then we also have, of course, researchers and UX designers, UX engineers, so that I get that context and so that I can weigh in really at every step of the process, even pretty early on. And then over the course of the day, normally, people will log off over the course of the morning, my time here in the US, which is nice as a writer because it means that I have pretty quiet afternoons to actually focus and do that deep work. And that's something that I really appreciate because it's something that's hard to find when you're in an office where, you can get that desk knock really any time of the day. So being able to really focus and take a deep dive into what I'm working on in a quiet space is really helpful. But with that being said, we're on Slack all day. We have Zoom all day. So normally over the course of the day, I'll get a Slack message asking me a quick question. I, usually respond with a million more questions because I want to make sure that I understand exactly what's going on. And more times than not, we'll just hop on a quick Zoom call. There's a great, actually, command right in Slack that starts a Zoom meeting for you. So we'll hop on, turn on video, share a screen, walk through the process, and then I can go back to that quiet time, that deep work to tackle the problem at hand.
It's a good way to do it. I think what surprises me, and I should say for disclosure, I actually write articles for the Invision blog, and working with the people who manage the blog, and now talking to yourself, I think one thing that comes across is that you're all extremely positive people, and you seem very quite bright, not just smart, but bright in terms of demeanor. And I think I have a theory that that's probably because you are working remotely. You probably need to have that positive, optimistic attitude in order to work productively together. If you're, I guess, not downtrodden, but if you're grumpy, it's not going to work very well working remotely because I can imagine that the productivity would go down. Is that right? Am I right there? Because it seems like you're all extremely happy people.
I about it that way. I mean, I agree. I think generally the company as a whole is generally very positive and optimistic and just friendly in general. I mean, I always thought that it was probably partially just because of, having more flexibility in that work-life balance where, if you need to go pick up your kids from school, and you can take 5 minutes to do so, then that's totally fine. And I think that builds a little bit more understanding and camaraderie into how the company works together. You totally get it if you need to go answer the door, because a delivery guy showed up, in the middle of your meeting or something like that. So I think there's just kind of that common understanding there, which helps. And I mean, in general, I've met, most of the company in person. We fly everyone out at least once a year to meet up. We have another all company meetup scheduled for this upcoming February. So it is fun to meet everyone in person. And the sense that I've gotten is that everyone really is, just like such a great, positive, understanding person, whether you're behind a screen or in person.
Yeah, and no wonder you have such an emphasis on written communication, and obviously the Invision blog is highly well regarded within the industry, and it's no wonder because you obviously have to rely on written communication so much for your everyday work. So there's obviously that built-in respect for the written word and communicating that way.
Definitely. And I mean, especially when it comes to the blog, I can take no credit for that because that's the great content marketing team over in the marketing org. But I mean, just speaking to the fact that you've written so many great articles for the blog, and a lot of that content comes from the design community. So I think a lot of that also speaks to, just the fact that everyone wants to kind of get together and nerd out and write these articles and, share their common understanding. I think that the success of the blog comes from not only the great team that we have on the ground, but also the larger design community as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I could sit here and talk to you all day about this sort of stuff, but I did say that I would take up no more than an hour of your time, and we are heading to an hour. So I do want to start to wrap up here. But one thing I ask everyone before we finish, and I apologize, I didn't ask you this question beforehand, so I'm putting you on the spot here because that's how I usually get the best responses. But I usually ask for people who are in UX writing right now or are thinking of getting into UX writing, what's something they can go away and read that you think would be beneficial to their work?
So I always point people to John Sato's Medium articles. I mentioned him earlier. He was, really the guy that got coffee with me very, very early on. He's actually one of the people that pointed out that Invision was hiring a UX writer and to begin with. So he has created incredible content for people who are not only starting out in UX writing, but even for people who have been writing for years and years and years. It's all written with a very approachable tone. He's just such a kind guy, and everything that I've seen come, from his Medium articles has been endlessly helpful. But with that being said, there's so much great content out there. I think Shopify has a ton of incredible content as well. Biz Sanford not only speaks very often, I've been very lucky to meet her in person, but also tends to turn those talks into articles as well. So Medium in general, if that can be my answer, there are so many incredible people out there that are very generously sharing their thoughts and sharing a lot of the knowledge that they've picked up along the way.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, Sophie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate your time. And for anyone online, where can they find you online if you have anything that you broadcast or you want them to read? Yeah.
I mean, in general, I'm just getting back into Twitter, so I'm at Tahran. It's STAHRAN. It's some design stuff, some writing stuff, a lot of dog stuff. So I'd say that's really the best place to reach out to me. And I'm always happy to hear from writers, designers, people that also like tweeting about dogs. I'm always happy to connect.
Awesome. Thanks again, Sophie. This has been great.
Thank you.
There you go. There's my interview with Sophie Tahran from Invision. If you enjoyed the podcast, please feel free to leave a review at Apple Podcasts, get in touch with me on Twitter at PDStafford, or shoot me an email at patrick@staffordcontent.com. I've got another interview coming up in 2 weeks, so I'll see you back here then. Take care.